Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten, or climbing out of the tombs. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send Thaddeus Forge to steal your heathen soul. Unknown horror masters, send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will continue to feed our ghouls for now. Books, websites, podcasts, in the links below. Children of Horror, Legion of Ghouls. Tonight, the season of Halloween has arrived. Each day, night, or hell, whenever the spirit commands us, we'll be presenting all manner of Halloween-themed tales, short stories, a novel or two, and much more. Tonight, The Seal of the Satyr by Robert Bloch. Roger Talquist had always known that he would return to Greece. The spell laid upon him in childhood had lingered through the years. After his father had brought him back to school in England, he never could forget the beauty of the ancient hills, of which the shepherd poets sang. Talquist's later career in archaeology emphasized the hold of the pagan on his soul. He dreamed of purple hills and marble ruins gleaming beneath an age-yellowed ivory moon. It was inevitable that he returned, and when the Oxonian expedition went to excavate a temple of Poseidon, he accompanied it to the land of his boyhood. Once arrived, his interest in the work itself slackened. He did his routine duties diffidently and spent all of his free time wandering through the wild country beyond the seaport of Milanos. A short walk would bring him to the mystic hills and the shadowed treelands. His imagination quickened in the forest silence as he mused on the old lore of paganism he'd heard from peasants. Dryads dwelt in the woods, and harpies hovered. Skyways beckoned Roger Talquist to climb the green-studded stairs of the mountains, until, from some lofty eminence, he could gaze down on the plains where once lambs had gambled to the fabled piping of the goat god. It pleased him to have believed the ancient legends, and he decided to compile a monograph on local superstition. Here the rustics still knew the myths of Pan and the forest spirits. Talquist spoke Greek fluently, and the natives made him welcome in their simple cottages while they told of forgotten lore. And here, Roger Talquist met old Papa Lepolus, a tall, patriarchal oldster with the wrinkled, august face of some Cretan sea king. Papa Lepolus promised the dark, gray-eyed scientist an actual glimpse of an altar where his people had once worshipped the gods of the forest. It was an ancient place in the forest, a grotto where primitive folk had paid worship to the nature gods in olden days before the recording of history. Here were ruins that only a few knew about. The grotto was kept secret now that the Greek Orthodox Church held sway. Here were stones and carvings which might interest an archaeologist greatly, Papa Lepolus told him. Take me there, Talquist said eagerly. I must see this grotto. Lepolus grew silent, stroked his beard, then scowled. I wonder if I dare, Mr. Talquist. Dare? Talquist exclaimed. You and I, we are modern men. We do not fear what the ignorant peasants hereabouts still tremble before. They are afraid? But what is there for them to fear? Leplis stared at the floor. Nothing, perhaps. But in that grotto, there is an altar where once men bowed to Pan. And they did more than that. Talquist listened eagerly. Yes, Leplis went on. If legends are to be believed, worshippers did a great deal more than bow. They gave sacrifices. You mean animals? No, Mr. Talquist. I do not mean animals. The forest gods desired things of men, the warm, living flesh of young maidens, and youth sated their divine appetites. Talquist smiled tolerantly. Well, what of it? Human beings were sacrificed in groves thousands of years ago. So what? I've heard of such things, of course. Surely today there's nothing to fear because once blood was spilled. But you do not understand, my friend. Do you know why there were such sacrifices? What the ancients believed? No, Talquist admitted. The old man whispered through his beard. They said that the gods appeared in human form at certain times, and at other times in the shapes of beasts. Shepherds and wandering maidens met the old nature gods on lonely hills. And later, there were satyrs and fauns, half beast, half human. Oh, I know of such myths, Leplis. Satyrs, centaurs, goat-headed men tumble all over themselves in Greek mythology. So what? These creatures had divine blood in them, Mr. Talquist, and as such, they did not die. Talquist's eyes widened. What? You mean that you're afraid the forest and the altar are, perhaps, guarded by fabled monsters? No, nothing as childish as that, the old man reproved. Talquist wondered whether he went sincere in his denial. And what bothers you, Leplis? Only this. When the ancients made sacrifice on the altar, they received gifts in return. Do you understand? They gave blood, and the gods gave gifts in exchange. Terrible gifts, Mr. Talquist. Talquist stared at the old man. What do you mean? I cannot say exactly. Worshippers wanted things from the gods. They wanted the immortality that fauns and satyrs and dryads received. So sometimes the gods would leave tokens and amulets. Those that wore them were supposed to be changed. Talquist was scornful. Are you trying to tell me that you believe such? No, not exactly, Papa Leplis replied slowly. Then take me to the altar, the young scientist insisted. The old man's eyes avoided Talquist's face. I do not show people the grotto, he mumbled. It is a secret in our family. Better not to know some things. I was a fool to suggest it. Talquist made a little pile of drachmas on the table. Leplis looked at the coins, shuffled his feet in silence. Then he smiled. I am an old man, Mr. Talquist, an old, tired man. It is hard for me to travel, but I will lead you to the altar in the forest if you wish. Talquist smiled patiently. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. It was a strange pair that set out the next day through the woodland pathways. Tall, bearded Papa Lepelus, in his ragged robes, led the trimly dressed Roger Talquist through the dense semi-twilight. As they walked along, the trees, shrubbery, and vines grew thicker and more tangled. The sun shone through in only a few spots. At first, Talquist had followed the old man along a definite path where birds sang gaily from the branches. Now they plunged deeper into the greenish darkness between twisting trees, and there was no life here, only a palpitant stillness. The stillness was of the ancient past. This was the deep forest of an older Greece, undisturbed through 3,000 years. Here centaurs pranced and whinnied beside the dark streams, and dryads capered upon cloud-crowned hilltops to the sound of hidden lutes. So Talquist imagined. He thought musingly of the myths told him by the oldster. They seemed appropriate enough now in this setting. Lepelus plodded ahead silently, almost furtively. Now that he had embarked on the trip, it seemed he did not relish this journey. Talquist noticed how the oldster kept peering over his shoulder toward the silent trees. Lepelus seemed frightened. It was almost as though he believed the fantastic fables of which he had spoken. Through deep glades and great lonely swamps they toiled, and again Talquist marveled that the old man did not lose his way in the trackless marshes. But at last they took a winding trail which led through a thicket and into a sunken grove, bordered by a land of tree-guarded twilight. Roger Talquist gazed in silence at their goal. His eyes noted the great grassy ring in the center of the low grade, and he saw that the crumbled stones surrounded it in a sort of half-imaginary pattern. It was a moot question whether these rocks had been naturally or artificially placed. If the latter, they had been laid at a time incredibly remote. But they did resemble a crude altar circle, and the great stone in the middle might easily have served the purpose of a sacrificial slab. They descended upon the grotto, and then Talquist took the lead while his aged guide hung back. Talquist examined the stones and noted the faint, rusty stains still visible on their tops. He fumbled amidst the fragments of broken rock that littered the bases of the altars in search of some ancient token or relic. And then Roger Talquist saw. The grass was damp and pressed down. The earth was wet. And in a circle about the central altar were the unmistakable imprints of hoofs. Talquist gasped. "Come here, Lepelus," he exclaimed. The old man looked down at the hoof marks, clear and fresh. He smiled unfathomably. "I warned you, Mr. Talquist. There are creatures who seek this lonely altar." "Nonsense," he stammered. "I merely wanted to ask you about wild goats. Are there any that might graze here?" The old man's smile was more enigmatic still. "Wild goats?" he said. "Look again, Mr. Talquist. These are not goat tracks." Talquist looked, and they were not goat tracks, these great hoof imprints in the earth. But they had to be. Why was Lepelus laughing so? "I warned you, Talquist," the old man went on. "I told you about what lurks, still undying, in the forest. I told you how my family knows, has always known, and guarded the secret of the ancient faith. I told you how one can sacrifice on this altar and receive a gift from the gods, a gift of eternal life and power. For the gods send a token conferring their reward upon the sacrifice. It is not pleasant to live in a changed shape, perhaps, but it is better than dying. What was the old fool raving about? Had he gone stark mad? Lepolis's voice was shrill now. I warned you, remember that. I tried to keep you from coming, but you insisted. I am weak, I know. Weak because I am old and do not want to die. I'm afraid to die. I would far rather live, even in changed shape. And so, Mr. Roger Talquist, now that we are at the altar, the time has come. It came then, so swiftly that Talquist was caught wholly unprepared. Even as he was speaking, Lepolis edged closer and closer. Then suddenly, from out of one ragged sleeve, a knife flashed. Lepolis raised the gleaming blade on high and brought it down in a vicious stroke. Talquist dodged desperately aside, just in time. But the old man, laughing insanely, was gripping him harshly by the throat. The knife raised again, and Talquist was forced back against the altar stone. The blade trembled. Lepolis tightened his grip, and Talquist knew with an icy heart that he must die. With the strength of panic, Roger Talquist raised his free arm and caught the old man's wrist. He lunged forward, twisting Lepolis against the stone, and then wrestled with the mad strength of the shrieking patriarch. The knife bit keenly several times as Lepolis stabbed futilely again and again. "Oh, greatgodpan, aid me!" screamed the old man. And then Talquist twisted the wiry wrist just as the blade thrust downward, and it turned. The knife buried itself inches deep in Lepolis's wrinkled throat, and a red stream poured out over the altar top as the coughing ancient fell in racking death upon it. Talquist stepped back aghast. The hysteria of the last few moments had left him dazed. The earth seemed to spin around him madly. The stones moved, the darkness deepened, and in his wild fancy, Talquist heard the rumbling of thunder from beneath his feet. Then the shock was all over, and he stared mutely at the dead man on the altar. Lepolis had lured him here, believing in the myths he had himself revealed. He had tried to kill the young scientist on the altar, that he might receive the gift of eternal life, though in a changed shape, from the ancient gods. Lepolis had been mad. It was all a most unfortunate occurrence. Talquist turned. He must find his way out of the forest, and quickly. But what was this? In the shards at his feet, at the base of the altar, something glinted dully. Talquist stooped and picked it up. Funny. He hadn't noticed this when searching before. He held it against the light of the blood-red sunset. It was an octagonally cut medallion of greenish stone, so worn and polished as to hint of extreme age. The medallion was fastened on a linked chain of true gold and was evidently designed to be worn around the neck. All this Talquist observed in a fleeting moment, for his eyes and thoughts were directed now on the startling figure emblazoned on the face of the amulet. There was something about the technique of the design that puzzled Talquist, even while it disturbed him. The lines did not seem as though executed by human thought. Each artist puts into his work something of himself, and what the designer had put into this figure was horribly alien. The goat seemed to be a symbol of another figure underneath. A figure Talquist couldn't make out, but which he knew instinctively was lurking there. The metal was of a peculiar luster. The carving was unnatural, and looking at the thing somehow shocked Talquist. The goat was the symbol of Pan, and perhaps the wild ravings of Lepidus, with his talk of gifts from forest gods, had unnerved the scientist. Roger Talquist stared at the evil figure as he absently fastened the golden chain about his neck. With a start, he realized what he was doing. Why had he put the amulet on? He raised his hand to remove it, and as he touched the stone, he received a second shock. The stone was quite warm. There was a tingling in Talquist's fingertips, a tingling not altogether unpleasant. The stone was radiant and warm as ardent flesh, as though it possessed some radioactive properties. In a second, the sensation passed, and Talquist was brought sharply back to reality. A breeze now curled out of the encroaching night. The twilight grove was eerie, and the trees were fantastic figures bowing in the wind. They stretched long green arms as though to bar the wanderer's path. For a moment, Talquist had the absurd notion that these trees would conspire to keep him in the forest. He looked again at the dead man on the altar, then glanced down at the horrible, unexplained tracks at his feet and shivered. He must get out of this grotto. Talquist started across the grove to the thicket. Halfway across, the last red rays of sunlight glinted on his chest, and he glanced down again to see the amulet moving in a slow arc. He touched it, and a painful shock stabbed his fingertips again. Once more he knew fear, because now he felt life pulsing in the stone. It was living animation he felt, the sensation of powerful forces running in waves through his hand and up the length of his arm. The contact somehow invigorated Talquist. He looked at the carved figure of the prancing goat that blazed up, and his eyes smarted and burned. The same eerie force tingling through his fingers now seemed to dance into his eyes and into the brain behind them. There was a force in the stone. Lepidus, with his wild talk of a change in the men who found the gifts of the old gods. Lord, could the fool have been speaking the truth? After all, Lepidus had been killed, though not intentionally, on that altar like a sacrifice. Whereas the old man had meant to sacrifice Talquist and receive in reward the grant of immortality, though he would be changed in some indefinable way by the divine blood of satyrs. But Lepidus had died, and then Talquist had found this peculiar talisman. Odd that he hadn't seen it before when he searched. Had it been sent after the sacrifice? That thunder from below his feet. Oh, that was absurd. There were no forest gods in this 20th century. Hoofprints in the grass. Talquist tried to think of something else. Paradoxically enough, that was simple. His own body. Why was he suddenly feeling so strange? He had a sudden impulse to tear the amulet from his throat, and his fingers instinctively tightened about it. There came a rapid acceleration of that flowing force within him, so that his arms seemed numb, as though from an electric shock. What was this terrible thing doing to him? Changing him? God. His body did ache. His arms and legs burned. There were sharp twinges in his thighs as he stumbled on, the kind of stabbing throb which in childhood had been spoken of as growing pains. Growing pains? In a sort of panic, Talquist tried desperately to be sane. It was rheumatism. That's what it was. He had caught a chill in the damp and dew of the woods. His legs hurt from walking in tight boots. He loosened his shirt as he walked across the glade, untied the lacings then, stopping to remove his boots. He seemed feverish. His head felt constricted, yet through the dull throbbing ran a thin red thread of exultation. He was terrified, yet strangely joyous. Fever? Perhaps. His body, despite the pain, no longer seemed a part of him. He stroked his brow, and he scarcely recognized the convolutions. Feeling the stubble on his cheeks, he wondered if he had remembered to shave that morning. His hands were bronzed, and his fingers still tingled from the shock of the amulet. He ought not to go on. He must rest. Shirtless, barefooted, Talquist flung himself down in the shadow of a bush at the edge of the glade. The last flicker of sunset crossed his chest. His eyes focused again on the burning green brightness of the amulet, and as he stared, his whole being turned to liquid flame. He felt oddly tortured, racked. His muscles stretched, tautened, and nerves ached with an exquisite pain that was almost animal ecstasy. He could not move his eyes or raise his hand to drop the talisman and claw off the burning band of gold about his throat. Yet his brain was enthralled by a tormented bliss, though another part of his consciousness shrieked, hypnotism, magnetism, madness. But his being continued to writhe in bondage to the living stone. Abruptly came the release. Dusk flooded the grove, and its purple pallor mingled oddly with the green lambency of the flaming amulet on Talquist's chest. Roger Talquist rubbed his eyes. Why was he lying here on the grass? What had he been doing? He felt no pain now, only a hot surging of blood through quickened veins. He could feel the shrill singing at his temples. Why had he wanted to run away? Why had he feared the power of the amulet? It was pleasant here in the forest at night, and the tingling in the talisman now was flowing through his body evenly in invigorating waves. Whatever the power in this seal of the satyr, be it natural or supernatural, it was good. He had been a fool to dwell on such obscure fears. Talquist rose to his feet, hardly conscious of his nakedness, and faced the edge of the grotto once again. Through the haze of dusk, he saw the standing stones shining whitely. The grass seemed greener and more lush about the bases. There seemed to be new life here. The rocks appeared larger and more numerous than in the afternoon. He soon realized that they were arranged in a circle so as to form a crude pattern. Talquist wanted to step over and examine them, but something halted him in the shadow of the bushes. From afar came the sound of conches. Into the glade marched a small procession of bearded men robed in white. There were perhaps a dozen of them, and Talquist vaguely recognized faces from the village. Then there was still worship here. Priest, if priest they were, gathered around the central altar, and Talquist saw that they discovered the body of Lepidus with great surprise. They stood there, huddled and whispering in the twilight. "He told us that the young foreigner would be ready," whispered one loudly enough for Talquist to overhear. "Something has gone amiss. Let us go quickly before they assemble." Yes, they will come for the body. We will leave the incense burning here, but the talisman is already gone. Hasten! I am afraid. The men produced small bundles of sticks which they lighted on the 8 outer stones. Great clouds of perfumed smoke wafted to wooded skies. It was a scene from old Greece, the ancient Greece of mystic forest gods. The body of Lepidus lay on the central altar, and the pungent smoke rose all about him. The old men hurried off then, whispering and casting veiled glances back into the glade. Talquist crouched watching, his breathing excited and irregular. For a long moment, there was utter silence. Then began a curious rustling, a slithering of leaves upon the trees, and a purposeful padding as of hoofs upon the grass. The sun had died in fathomless crimson skies, and the moon rose from the pallid purple of the east. It shone down upon the grotto as the rustling noises increased. A silver moon shaft sped across the central altar, and as it did so, a faint, shrill peeping filled the air. Hysterically high, the treble notes sounded from far away, the peeping summons of a syrinx. The peeping blended with rustling. The spicy perfume from the fire scented the forest dark. And now other sounds were audible, queer moanings and high neighing, chirping and animal growls. Another scent, or combination of scents, mingled with the perfume. The musk-like odors of beasts and creatures of the wood. Talquist stared and saw, and nearly shrieked. For into the grove the forest creatures headed, bounding and leaping and pawing the hard-packed earth. Shaggy and manlike, the fawns capered about in the moonlight, their goatish beards wagging to their squealing laughter. Here were the living creatures of myth. Whole-bodied maenads stamped into the glade with throaty bellows of guttural mirth, shaking their hairy heads in bovine playfulness. Across the sward, the centaurs pranced, their sly, wicked faces wreathed in lustful grimace, their stallion bodies flexed with animal vigor. They snorted and reared, bringing spiked hooves down to strike fire from the altar stones. Now Talquist understood the hoof prints on the grass. Hoarse cries, the Egyptians bounded in, lifting their horrid goat heads to bleat at the moon, and stretching their shambling legs and shapeless paws in animal ecstasy as they sniffed the aromatic incense of the spice perfume. The far-off piping grew more frantic still, and the whirling forest creatures laughed more shrilly, whirled more wildly, sniffing the reek of the smoke, and bathing in moonlight as they danced and gesticulated amidst the altar stones. Talquist gasped. Fabled legends come true. He glanced down at the seal of the satyr on his breast, then looked up as a shrill screaming sounded. The living shadows of nymphs emerged from the rushes that bordered the stream within the forest. They danced over the grass and flung their wet green hair in carefree abandon as they wheeled before the beastmen. There was one green-haired creature with eyes red as blood that Roger Talquist watched closely. The strength surging in him leaped at the sight of her as she postured with the rest. Now the creatures saw what lay upon the altar top. A fawn crept close, gesturing to his less emboldened companions. One hairy paw reached out to touch the body of Lepidus. A black satyr capered before the corpse, His nostrils flared as he fumbled at the old man's beard. A centaur trotted past, so that his sweaty flanks brushed the stone. The nymphs tittered shrilly. They gathered before that inner altar, and their eyes and hands and lips caressed would lay upon it, and they laughed and bleated. When they turned away, they dragged the body with them. The piping scurried higher in its shrillness. The peeping syrinx, the scent of smoke, the shrieking laughter. These things finally made Talquist emerge from the bushes. He did not think of what he had seen. He felt only the drumming of the incredible scene in his blood, fusing his being in strange response. The dance of the forest creatures had become a pursuit, and the nymphs fled before the insane figures that scurried after them in the darkness. Hoarse screams filled the night. Then the syrinx sounded, swelled, merged into a gigantic, triumphant bleat. The horde bore the body of Lepidus into the dark forest. Talquist, his blood sweet fire, raced after the others about the altar. It was a strange madness that possessed him, that gave him a sense of curious kinship with these beings of the past. They shrieked when they saw him and pointed to the glowing green amulet on his chest, but he did not hear. His eyes were searching for a figure, the figure of the green-haired nymph with the red eyes. She saw him and turned with a mocking leer. Talquist hated the sight, but something inside him urged his body forward. He ran toward the taunting nymph. She fled in mimic dismay back into the dark groves, where now the distant piping died away. Talquist ran through the forest, following the fleet wood sprite that leaped ahead, the wet green hair blending with the leaves of the livid trees. His temples burned. He gasped for breath, and his being was filled with a nameless strength. He loped after the fleeing figure, maddened by her taunting laughter that drifted back through the nighted pathways. Soon he emerged upon the bank of a little stream where now the nymphs and the nereids had returned. The fleet little creatures splashed noisily through the reeds and sank into the pool, diving beneath the rushes. None of them re-emerged. Roger Talquist, fired by his madness, leaped after the taunting figure of the nymph he pursued, and the amulet jangled against his chest on its chain. She turned suddenly on the bank and grinned up at him with slyly parted lips and tossed her snake-locked hair. Her moist, flabby hands pawed at Talquist's arms. Her red eyes were not human, and gazing into them, Talquist abruptly lost his madness and tried to push the creature away. She stepped back on the bank. Noticing the amulet on the chain, she reached for it. Talquist pushed her away again. Sniggering, the nymph reached out, a cold hand to grasp at him for support. Instead, her fingers closed about the chain. She stepped back further, clutching the green seal, and lost her balance. With a wrench, the links parted, and the nymph fell screaming into the water. The amulet in her hand described a jeweled arc, then slipped beneath the churning surface of the stream and sank. Nymph and seal of the satyr disappeared together in the pool. Roger Talquist stood on the bank, staring stupidly at the widening circles in the water. He remembered now. He was cold, naked, standing in the woods at midnight after chasing the phantoms of fever and delirium. There had been no sacrifice, no nymphs or satyrs. It had all been a dream, a delusion brought on by the peculiar hypnotic power of the amulet he had stared at when he lay down. It was gone now, that strange talisman. He had probably flung it into the water himself in a final frenzy. Well, good riddance to the cursed stone. Old Lepidus had been right, in a way. The seal of the Satyr, whether a gift of the ancient gods or not, did change a person. Wearing it, Talquist had not been himself. He had become some kind of beast. His mind had undergone a peculiar change which made him feel kinship with the wild creatures of elder myth. Lepidus had said that such things still existed in the forest and came forth after a sacrifice. And indeed, these things had come to pass. Poor Lepidus! He had believed it all, and he wanted the amulet because he thought it would make him a forest creature that could live forever. He had wanted it enough, believed enough, to risk murder. And he was dead, and the amulet was gone. Talquist mused. Oddly enough, he had not believed the old man's tale that the amulet could change one. He should have known it was some kind of allegory. The seal caused a mental change rather than a physical one. Assuredly, it had hypnotized him into thinking his body was different. Indeed, he had felt different. Still did, in fact. Those tingling vibrations. But what was he doing here? Better go back to the hotel now and try to forget his delirium. Talquist gave a final glance at the waters of the pool, into which the amulet had been thrown. The waters were calm now, and there was a glassy reflection in the clear moonlight. Talquist saw his own reflection in the moon-flooded depths, saw himself in nature's silvery mirror. Head, forehead, face, throat, arms, body, legs. He saw them all. And then he understood the real truth of Lepidus's incredible story of gifts from the gods that would change a man. He did not look long. A single moment of numbing realization, and then he leaped into the pool. Leaped straight into the deepest water, breaking with his body the mad reflection he had seen on the mirrored surface. For, staring down at himself, Roger Talquist had seen the face and the figure of the wood god Pan. Thank you for listening. Have a great night.